Guten Tag and willkommen to my Germany 1871 to 1990 vlog. This is episode 6, and today we're starting depth topic 2. This depth topic looks at the collapse of Bismarck's Kaiserreich in 1919 after the First World War, and the circumstances that led to that. So today we're going to introduce that and think about why it was that Germany ended up in such a fragile state towards the end of the war. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm II had become Emperor of Germany, and he'd fallen out with Bismarck a couple of years later and sacked him in 1890. And the period really from then onwards to into the First World War is known as the Wilhelmine Era of Germany, because Kaiser Wilhelm II, unlike Kaiser Wilhelm I, Kaiser Wilhelm II was quite a dominant figure in the politics of that era. And although there were chancellors obviously underneath him, it was his kind of strategy and his worldview and policy that held sway. And that was known popularly as Weltpolitik, the idea of trying to expand Germany and both to gain popularity within Germany, but also, I think, probably because this is what he felt the Germans should be doing, to try and gain an empire. Unfortunately for the Kaiser, he was kind of frustrated in several maneuvers to try and gain an empire or to gain extra kudos internationally in the run-up to the First World War. And lots of historians think that because of that, when the crisis unfolds in 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II is already at a point where he will consider going to war. And that's exactly what happens. So in 1914, you might remember that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, was shot by a nationalist in Sarajevo. And at that point, the Germans gave what was known as the blank check to the Austro-Hungarians. And they said, basically, whatever happens, we've got your back. We will help you out in this mess. Don't worry. We are your allies and your friends, and we won't let you down. And so what happens is that Austria-Hungary ends up declaring war on Serbia. The Russians move in to help to help Serbia, and to help themselves. And so Austria-Hungary and Russia are going to fight each other. And at that point, Germany declares war on Russia, but also because Russia are now allied with France and Britain, Germany has to declare war on France and Britain, or risk running into a war with them later on. The German plan for this sort of conflict is known as the Schlieffen Plan, and it involved defeating France and Britain very quickly, within 6 weeks, which they were confident they could do because, of course, they'd done it in the Franco-Prussian War, a mere kind of 45 years earlier, and defeat France within 6 weeks, and then rush eastwards to defeat Russia. Now, Russia, being big, being less industrialized, would take about 6 weeks just to get its army in the right place to fight a battle. So the Germans were fairly confident this would work out, but of course it didn't work out like that. They got defeated at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, and from that point on, the First World War bogs down into trench warfare and being quite a static affair. However, before we rush into what happens in the war, it's worth noting that at the point that war is declared, the war itself is actually quite a popular conflict within Germany, and that's because the Chancellor Bethlen Hollweg had been very careful to pitch the war as Germany going to help their friends and allies Austria-Hungary against big bad Russia. No mention was made of the blank check that the Germans had given to the Austro-Hungarians, and no mention is made of any territorial aims which the German High Command later on really stipulated and made a part of the way out of the fighting, part of their war aims. And so you have in the summer of 1914 what's called the Burgfriede, this idea of complete unity in Germany. Burgfriede, B-U-R-G, F-R-I-E-D-E. In fact, at that point, the Kaiser said, "I know no parties anymore, only Germans." Everyone's united around this. It's united to such a degree that even the Socialist Party voted in favour of the war budget, giving money to the army in the Reichstag, and an estimated 1 million war poems were sent to newspapers in August 1914. 1 million war poems. It's a different era completely. So at the start of the war, Germany as a whole, politically and socially, is united around this idea of war, probably because they've gone to war, they think, for noble reasons, but quite quickly they run into issues. As I said already, the army gets bogged down on the Western Front and then, of course, has to start fighting in the East against the Russians. And Germany discovers that actually their economy is not as self-sufficient as it perhaps ought to be. They already had substantial deficit in their economy from before the war, and the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg's strategy of printing money through the war leads to inflation, meaning things cost more, but of course wages weren't increasing. Added to which, quite quickly, they run into trouble of supply for food. About a third of Germany's food was imported from overseas, and the British Navy in particular organises a blockade around the north of Germany. Of course, they're fighting France on the west, Russia on the east. So they've only really got the southern border at work, and that's where Austria-Hungary are fighting against the Serbs and the Russians down there, and then the Turks as well. So it's very difficult to get food into Germany, and this starts to cause food shortages pretty quickly in the war. In 1915, 35% of Germany's pig population was slaughtered so that they wouldn't be such a drain on foodstuffs. Of course, that then later on obviously leads to a shortage of meat for humans. And later on, again in 1916-17, in that winter, the potato crop fails, leading to what's known as the Turnip Winter, because people had to eat turnips because there's nothing else to eat. All in all, across the war, an estimated 750,000 people died in Germany due to starvation, due to malnutrition and lack of food. Actually, that ramps up through the war. So in 1916, there's an estimated 120,000 dying, I think, of starvation or hypothermia. By 1918, it's just short of 300,000 people in that year alone. And because of that, as the war goes on, factions, that's the word, factions appear amongst the German population. So there's an urban-rural split because people in towns, their prices are going up and there's a scarcity of food, and they start to think that probably part of that's because farmers are keeping stuff to themselves. People in the countryside are annoyed about people in the towns, and they're also annoyed that their livestock the horses are being taken for the army. People in poorer classes are annoyed about wages, and also that the more wealthy in society can afford to buy food on the black market. So there's very much a kind of a split feeling amongst society, and whereas at the start everyone's united around the war aims, these fractures and divisions continue and get worse through the war. It's not just a case of everyone feeling against the war effort. It's also worth saying that the left and the right political wings start to blame different people as well. So the right wing blame Jews and socialists for the problems that Germany is having, whereas the left, of course, are more pro-socialist and therefore blame Junkers and the party elites for the difficulties. Now, so the war itself was progressing. Well, actually, let's deal with other stuff first. So all of that means that by 1917, the socialists themselves, who had been in favour of the war to start with, have fractured as a party. And the USPD, the Independent Socialist Party, is formed out of a group of socialists who decide to be against the war and peel away from them. There are 42 USPD members to start with, leaving behind 68 socialists as the majority socialist party, led by Friedrich Ebert. The USPD are linked to the Spartacus League and organise several strikes in and around Berlin in protest against the war. So there's a growing anti-war movement amongst the left wing. In part to combat that, and the Fatherland Party is established. This is backed significantly by industrialists, and actually quite quickly the Fatherland Party gains a following of around an estimated 1 million members. So that's quite a lot more successful at gathering people together, and suggests that actually that it was by no means everyone who was anti-war by this stage. On the military side of things, as I said, in 1914 there's a defeat for the Germans, and by 1916 they're ready to go again, and so they make a big assault at Verdun, but that over months of fighting turns into a bit of a nightmare for them. In total, Verdun is estimated to have cost 430,000 German lives, either killed or wounded, but not able to fight anymore. It's similarly, the French army is decimated by it, but still, this is a big blow to the German chances of winning the war, and leads to the sacking of the German army leader, Falkenhayn. He is replaced by Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor, replaces him with Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff. Hindenburg became Chief of the General Staff, and Ludendorff became Quartermaster General, but together they are given command of the army, and they're told basically to sort this out. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were given the job because they had won a spectacular victory against the Russians early in the war at the Battle of Tannenberg, and they were extremely popular and had the confidence of a lot of the public as well as the army. And although Bethmann Hollweg gets them in to do him a job and to serve the country, actually they become known as the Silent Dictators because their position is so influential that they are able to badger, bully, and push around Bethmann Hollweg in order to get what they want. If anything goes against them, then Hindenburg and Ludendorff threaten to resign. They say, oh, well, if you can't do that, I will resign. And Bethmann Hollweg is aware that actually that will create many more problems for him. With that in mind, Bethmann Hollweg is forced into a position where he, under Hindenburg and Ludendorff's influence, gets more and more of the resources of Germany are put under the command of the army. And so the examples, the Auxiliary Services Act is passed in December 1916. This means that the army can control the male labour of any male in Germany from the age of 17 all the way up to 60. A Supreme War Office is set up that has sweeping powers over industry and labour. So as another example, that the Kaiser feels under pressure to promise democratic reforms at the end of the war to keep left-wingers happy, and Ludendorff tells him to water down his speech in his so-called Easter Promise. So Hindenburg and Ludendorff are not just restricted in their influence to military matters, they start to get involved in the economy, even in political affairs. And as the situation gets worse for them in 1917, as the situation deteriorates for Germany, so they also start to take greater risks. And one of those is to bring about the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. And that's the idea that German submarines will be given permission by the German High Command to sink any ship that they see approaching Britain or France. That ultimately leads to the US entering into the war and turns out to be extremely damaging for Germany's chances of victory. So we'll leave it there. So what we've got there is, just to recap, that Germany was united around what was quite a popular war in 1914, but because of living conditions and because the war wasn't going very well, by 1917 there was quite a fractured opinion about whether the war was worth carrying on, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been installed as army leaders, but they had their influence spread across the economy and across politics, and they were a very dominant force to the extent that they are called the Silent Dictators, again by 1917. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.